All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking at a pretty incredible piece of history today, a moment where one ancient text completely flipped a man's life upside down and, kind of by accident, kicked off a massive global movement. We're talking about Romans chapter 5 and its absolute collision course with a guy named John Wesley. So, can you do everything right and still feel just completely empty? Man, it's a question that cuts deep. It's that ultimate burnout of trying to earn your own worthiness. I know a lot of us, especially as guys, are basically hardwired to measure our value by our output, right? By our performance, checking all those boxes. We think if I just grind a little harder, I'll finally feel good enough. Well, as we're going to see, that is the exact trap our subject was completely stuck in.
Look at John Wesley's resume. Honestly, it's intimidating. He was an ordained Anglican priest, a disciplined missionary, relentlessly fasting, praying, doing charity work. Outwardly, flawless. But if you look at the imagery here, you see the heavy chains, that absolute void weighing him down. Because despite crushing it on paper, he had zero inner peace. He was on this exhausting, totally fruitless chase for holiness, secretly terrified that he didn't even have real saving faith despite all his religious achievements.
Section 1. The Quest for Inner Peace. Let's trace his timeline real quick through the 1720s and 30s. He's ordained. He's incredibly strict with himself, basically trying to force spiritual peace through sheer willpower. But check out step 3 in 1735, his missionary trip to Georgia. He's on a ship, they hit this terrifying storm, and he runs into a group of Moravian Christians. Now, staring death in the face, these Moravians are completely calm, total assurance, and their quiet faith completely exposed Wesley's own internal panic. He realized right then and there, he had religion, sure, but he didn't have any inner certainty. That specific crisis of confidence set him on a crash course with a date that would literally change history.
Section 2. The Aldersgate Awakening.
All right, let's set the scene here. May 24th, 1738. Wesley is back in London. He is defeated, he's exhausted, and frankly, he feels like a total spiritual failure. He drags himself to this small meeting on Aldersgate Street. While he's sitting there, someone is just reading aloud, not even giving a fiery sermon, just reading Martin Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. And hearing this specific text, it fundamentally shifted Wesley's entire perspective. It was an argument that systematically dismantled his lifelong reliance on human achievement and replaced it with this radical concept of a divine gift. And that exact moment produced one of the most famous journal entries in Christian history. Wesley wrote, "I felt my heart strangely warmed." Now, this wasn't just some fleeting emotional flutter. This was a massive internal tectonic shift. His whole life, his faith had been this heavy intellectual duty. But sitting in that room, it transformed into an inward experience of divine love. The Holy Spirit finally gave him that personal, deep-down assurance that his sins were actually forgiven. So, the catalyst for this whole transformation is this definition right here, justification by faith. It's the realization that salvation is a gift of grace, received simply by trusting Christ. That's it. It is completely 100% independent of your human works, your striving, or your religious resume. For a guy who had literally exhausted himself trying to earn his way into God's good graces, you can imagine this concept was a total game changer. Section 3. Unpacking Romans chapter 5. Let's actually look at the text that did it. Breaking down the first 2 verses of Romans 5, we see this foundational shift. Since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God. Notice the firm ground here. Peace is presented as a gift you just stand in. It's not a wage you earn by trying harder. Paul also talks about having access to grace. Wesley finally got it. The Christian life isn't about white-knuckling your way through. It's sustained by standing continually in a grace that's already been provided for you. But Romans 5 isn't just some emotional appeal. Paul builds a really tight, logical argument here. Follow the progression. Step 1, suffering. That produces perseverance, which builds character, which ultimately leads to hope. And that hope, it doesn't disappoint, because God's love is poured into our hearts. Wesley realized that even his burnout, all those years of agonizing struggle, were actually part of a process leading him toward this concrete, unbreakable hope. Then we hit verse 8, and man, this is an absolute paradigm shifter. While we were still sinners, or as verse 6 puts it, when we were still powerless. This completely nuked Wesley's lifelong assumption. He always thought he had to become worthy first, before God would accept him. But Romans 5 argues the exact opposite. God's love was given when humanity was at its absolute worst. You don't clean yourself up to get the gift is handed right to you in the middle of the mess.
Section 4. Adam, Christ, and Grace. To quickly make sense of Paul's pretty complex argument in verses 12 through 21, let's look at this stark contrast. On the left side, you've got Adam. He represents human failure, one trespass that results in condemnation and death for everybody. Basically, a system of falling short. But then, on the right side, you have Christ, representing abundant divine provision. One righteous act, resulting in justification, grace, and life. The whole point is that you can't even compare the two. The grace on the right side infinitely overpowers the failure on the left. It's not even close.
And we absolutely have to connect this theology back to the real world, because Wesley's newfound understanding didn't just stay stuck in his head. It birthed a worldwide movement, the Methodist Revival. Because he had finally experienced it himself, he started preaching that outward morality just wasn't enough. The movement emphasized personal conversion, the absolute assurance of salvation, and the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit. Wesley literally took this academic theology out into the fields, telling everyday working-class people that they didn't have to earn God's love. Which brings us to the climax of the chapter, Romans 5:20. But where sin increased, grace increased all the more. This one sentence basically became the beating heart of Wesleyan theology. Wesley looked out at a broken world, and instead of just preaching condemnation, he preached that literally no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. It doesn't matter how high the ledger of human failure goes, the provision of divine grace is always going to overflow and absolutely swallow it up. So I want to leave you with a question to bring this whole historical explainer right down to your daily life. How would shifting from a mindset of performance to a mindset of grace actually change your perspective today? If you just stopped frantically trying to earn your worth and instead operated from a place of already being accepted, how would that change your stress levels? How would it change the way you treat yourself or the people around you? John Wesley spent decades exhausting himself before he finally just stopped and received the gift. Maybe it's time we learn from his struggle and start standing in grace.